Climate Change Committee's first ever podcast.
This podcast is run by Climate Change Committee, a club based in Massachusetts dedicated to spreading awareness about climate change.
I'm Sugita.
And I am Delara.
And we're today's hosts.
So today we are meeting with Samantha Perlman, Marlborough's youngest city councillor at large.
Hey, this is Samantha Perlman. I'm a city councilor at large, as was just said. I'm so excited to be here. The issue of global warming and climate change is so pertinent. It's a very urgent issue, and so I'm very excited to discuss, it's both what's happening in Marlborough locally and at the state level, but also a federal, and how we all can be involved in making sure that our world is greener.
First question, what is a Marlborough City Councilor at Large's favorite green activity?
I love this. And I was thinking about, I guess one of the things I really like to do is I really like bike riding. That is something that I feel like in the winter I've not been able to do as much. But I feel like I've been very impressed with the increase in the bike lanes and the bike trail, which is currently even cleared in the winter on the Marlborough side. So that's my definitely my favorite thing. And one of the things that's kind of like the nerdy climate thing I really like composting. I'm getting like immense joy from composting, and there's a new program in the city, which maybe we'll talk a little bit more later, but now I do it all the time. And so I love kind of making sure my food waste is separated and seeing that reduce my my waste overall as well. So definitely composting.
Okay, moving on. What is something most people don't know about climate change?
Great question. Well, one thing that comes to mind for me is even the language that we use to describe the conflict. So sometimes I prefer to use global warming, because sometimes that actually helps people understand that it's a systemic problem that we as humans are contributing to. Or sometimes the words climate change make us think that we're removed from the situation and it's happening at a slow pace and that humans aren't involved. So I think global warming speaks to the urgency, and it's something that, if we continue to shape it as global warming in our language with one another, it might also show the urgency to people who haven't changed their habits yet or aren't as involved in systemic policy changes.
Where have you seen environmental change in Marlborough?
Well, one thing that I just want to share is when I was younger, I think I was about 13. And so I'm Jewish, so I had a bat mitzvah. And one of the things we have to do is a project, like a community project. And I remember I decided to do like a street cleanup of trash with my friends. And I remember we had like t-shirts, and we did this whole initiative to clean up the different areas. And I think there is a lot of, waste that's even in public areas, on the sidewalks, et cetera. So that was something that I remember doing when I was really young, not even knowing sort of the systemic impact of how I could get more involved at a higher level. But I know that's something even the city does now, right? We have those cleanup days. People can get together in groups. It's even done, socially distant now during COVID. But there has been a lot of different changes, and I think of them in different buckets. So we've seen when the streets have been redone in the city, there's additive bike lanes, part of the state's complete streets model to make sure that there is an access for different types of transit. And also there's been investment the last couple of years in a commuter shuttle that, during the day helps seniors get to their appointments for joint travel, but also is intended to pick up from the commuter rail and deliver people directly to businesses where they're working in a lot of the industrial parks here in Marlborough. And I know that's really big to reduce car usage, which we know is like a huge pollutant right now. So I think that's been a good initiative as well. And also I know we've been planning on what's called like a municipal vulnerability plan. That's really important that the city has taken on, working with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, to make sure that we have a plan to help vulnerable populations, particularly seniors, low-income folks who might live in some of the most vulnerable parts of the city. So I know there's been that kind of planning happening, and also even an open space plan that I know is getting updated even right now, but kind of how do we preserve a lot of the natural resources in Marlborough. And even now I feel like I have a higher appreciation for open space in the city, given COVID, right? Being able to go to the desert trails or Cider Knoll, or be able to walk alone. And we have a lot of, green space, which is really wonderful. And I think we need to increase that. It's so important that we protect it for other generations, because even as you mentioned, it's changed over so many years that I think a lot of the things that even fields and farms and things that used to be around when I was a lot younger, now are housing complexes. And it's important to balance growth with this emphasis on opening green space.
Okay, so we know you're pretty active about climate change and renewable energy in Marlborough. So have there been any changes to your mission because of Corona?
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest things that I think even in like the aura of everybody is knowing the intersection between racial justice and social justice with climate change. I know it's sort of climate justice being the term that we would use, but how, communities of color, low income folks, and marginalized communities are most impacted, and how that should be the forefront of the way that we think about planning in the city. And really, like I said before, that emphasis on green space and open space. And one of the things that I really try to do in my position and even on social media is really educating the public. I think we all go about our lives, and even what you all are trying to do, right, spread awareness about these topics. It's so easy for people to get sucked into the day to day and not realize how some of their actions might be contributing to pollution, and that they can personally advocate for some high level changes. That even if you and I all compost every single day, and I drive a hybrid, I have a Prius, right, and I'm making all these life choices that are changing my habits. If I'm the only one doing that, or it's just the three of us, that will never amount to the type of change that we really need, which is why policy change is so important. And sometimes that is most effective at the state and federal level, where that decision will implement even more action from municipalities too.
Going off of your open space plan and what you've been talking about, how open spaces are really important for Marlborough residents, whether they're older or newer, and how those spaces can really add to the experience of living in Marlborough. How do you think that conservation lands benefit Marlborough?
Great question. I kind of think of it again like in two different fronts, sort of the impact on like wildlife and preservation of animals and the habitats, and also the benefit, to the well-being of a Marlborough resident. So a lot of our, conservation lands have wetlands which need to be protected, and they have very particular animals and plants that grow in that area. So it's extremely important to preserve them. And important, especially on the public well-being side, it's really important for people to have access to green spaces and open spaces. So sometimes I like to see, think broadly about where the parks are in the city, and are there neighborhoods that don't have access to green space? Every day there could be other, open space things that if they're not protected, the residents need to say this is a priority, and we want to make sure that we still have this as open land and green space.
Okay, so this is kind of a follow-up question, but how does the open space plan essentially fight climate change and make Marlborough more green?
Yes, I think this leads into a lot of what we've been talking about before. So oftentimes the city might purchase land that will contribute to an open space. And so it's so important to think about an open space plan in terms of continuing the wildlife protection. So it'd be really great to have those parcels be protected so that there's this entire complex, right? Because if you protect 2 acres and they're surrounded by highways, or a shopping plaza, that's very different than if you're able to protect land that's also surrounded by other protected land.
What do you want to do to reduce the city's greenhouse gas emissions, whether it's you or the Marlborough City Council or even the state as a whole? What have you guys been kind of thinking of doing and actually doing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, so a lot of this I know at the city level has happened, in the use of solar, like we talked about, or reducing the energy consumption in individual buildings, the LED lights, like I mentioned before. So I think a lot of it is sort of changing the structures in our city to get our energy from a variety of sources. So it's not just, polluted kinds of sources, but also being able to be open to, funding opportunities where maybe we get a grant and we're able to upgrade a lot of our systems. And also, I think part of this too is when we reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, we're really preserving both the future and the present. I think people think that, the global warming is something so far removed from our daily lives, as we talked about before. But, we're seeing the highest rates of hurricanes. I think it was hailing, at weird times, even in the city of Marlborough, right, when it wasn't even the winter. And we're seeing the firestorms, happening in the West Coast. And we're just having unprecedented natural disasters. And those are not just fluke accidents, right? Those are direct results of climate change and global warming. And I think it's important for leadership, right, especially young people who are leading the way, to be really sharing their stories, right? So people who face some of these natural disasters, but also how it doesn't have to be like this.
All right, so I know you touched on this a bit earlier, but outside of the Marlborough City Council, in your personal daily life, what do you do to fight climate change?
Yeah, so we talked about, I personally drive a Prius, I do the composting, I do tons of recycling. I also try to educate myself, right? I'm not knowledgeable in all areas. And so it's so important that I'm always up to date on what's happening both at the state and federal level as well. And sharing that with other people, right? I feel like, sometimes we can educate ourselves, but if we're not sharing that outwardly, that's also a problem. Also, wondering how you can change even where you spend your money, right? Are you supporting organizations that match your values? Are they divesting from fossil fuels? Are they, using renewable energy or recyclable materials?
How do you advocate for climate change related policies here in Marlborough? And how do you deal with colleagues and peers that don't acknowledge the issue of climate change?
Yeah, I think this is also a really good question because sometimes it's layered in even by generational issues. So sometimes people are coming at it from different angles. Like maybe they grew up, in this sort of era of abundance, right, where there was just this growth mentality, right, that the United States often possesses. And it's a hard transition for people to realize that there are, things that we have to scale back on and preserve. And oftentimes it's, put at at odds with finances and the economy, right? Which I don't think it has to be like that. They're so inextricably linked, economy and global warming. And until we acknowledge them both together, we're not doing each a good service. And so I think that part of it really is, acknowledging that people are coming in not only with different levels of buy-in, but even levels of knowledge. Even some people that I talk to that are like in my own age demographic, I don't think even see this as a priority issue. So being able to talk to this with everyone, friends, family, colleagues, is so important. And I think one of the best tools you can do is show that it is an intersecting issue with something that that person cares about.
Okay, so personally, I know a lot of people who do believe in climate change, but they don't really know like what to do. So do you have any advice for people who want to like start fighting climate change in their daily lives?
Yeah. So any of the things that we said that you can change in your daily life, right? We talked about, individual actions that you could take or where you're spending your money, and kind of making sure that your waste is recycled and composted to the highest degree. And like I said before, just seeing that you're coming at it as a young person is so important because you know that the decisions being made by people in positions of leadership are going to impact you, whether you're knowing it or not, right? So whether it's, learning about certain actions at the local level and going before the city council to speak at a public hearing, or even just reaching out to your city councilor and saying, this is an issue of importance to me. What is the city doing about it?
And speaking of leaders and taking initiative and all that, we are currently moving towards having a new president, Joe Biden. And we want to know, what are some of your thoughts on President elect Joe Biden's climate change plan that's focused on the US achieving 100% clean energy economy and reaching net zero emissions no later than 2050?
Yeah, what a wild time we have here in the United States. Obviously we've had many years of a deprioritization of the environment. So sometimes it's unfortunate that we had to go backward. So we're not really going forward. We're going back to where we are in many ways. And I would argue that it is wonderful to have a 100% clean energy economy and to reach net zero by 2050. Also, would be better if it was earlier, right? How can we get that action to happen? What is it, 2021? I mean, that's a long time, right? But I do think that the United States has to be a role model in this front. And I think, rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement is so important because the United States is one of the most, aggressive polluters in the world. And so if we're not on board, what kind of message does that send to other communities? So it's exciting to see this leadership happening, and I look forward to continuing to follow it as the years go by.
Okay, so you talked about people reaching out to elected officials about fighting for climate change, but is there anything else people can do to spread awareness?
Yeah, well, I think there's no shame in starting small, right? Like, what can I do today? What can I do tomorrow? And I think honestly, to me, one of the best things is where are you spending your money and looking at the budget, right? Like a budget of an organization that you support, or even your own school, right? Like, what do people spend money on is what they value. But I also say we get involved in an organization, right? So whether it's the one in AMSA or some of the broader movements statewide, um, even just joining and saying like, I don't really know a lot about this issue, but it interests me and is important, is really enough.
All right. We've covered all the questions now. So, are there any closing comments or anything you'd like to say before this episode slash interview is over?
Yeah, well, I'm so thrilled that you all invited me to be here. I think that conversations like this are the beginning of beautiful changes that we need to see here, both locally and at the state level. I would say, gather together with other young people and say, what do we want to achieve, right? What are the actions we can take? And I'm happy to be supportive in any way that I can.
All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
That
thank
pretty
you.
much wraps up today.
Okay, so My social media, Instagram and Twitter, and even I think Facebook is at Sam for Marlborough without the UGH. So feel free to reach out to me. I know that's a great way to connect and we can share information. And then my city email is sperlman, my last name, at marlborough-ma.gov. So those are my, personal handles. And then that is how to get in contact me with my city email.
Okay, that's perfect. Thank you so
Yep.
much.